Hello and welcome back to the One That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Andrew Jotischy, who has written The Monastic World, which I'm of course holding up right here, which is a fantastic read on monastic history from early to 4th century until the 13th century. And this is of course what you're going to discuss today. So I want to begin straight away with early form of monasticism because as you write in your book, it's being a martyr, it kind of started, as I understand it, as a form of alternative to martyrdom because it was kind of in to be a martyr, and when when it was legalized in the Roman Empire, it was kind of what do we do now? So it was kind of an alternative form of being a martyr. So let's talk a little bit about how early monasticism developed into what we know it as today.
Sure. The first monks appear in the sources at a time when Christianity was still persecuted by the Roman authorities. And so that link between monasticism and martyrdom was a very live and a very real one. And in fact, some early Christians themselves thought that monasticism had started with Christians fleeing into deserted places in order to escape persecution and martyrdom. That really isn't, really isn't any evidence for that. Monasticism seems to have, right from the start, encompassed people who were quite settled in or near villages. We can find evidence of both male and female monks in and around settled habitations in the late 3rd century in what used to be called the Fertile Crescent or the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, sort of Egypt, the Holy Land, Syria. It's very difficult to say it's really impossible to say when it started or even actually where it started. Egypt is usually credited with being the place of origin, but it's actually very difficult to pinpoint where the first monks appeared, whether it was Egypt or Syria.
So where would they settle down? Because when we think of monasteries, we think of these stone kind of buildings that we imagine medieval monasteries to be, but this wasn't the case with early
Yeah.
monasticism. So where did they find what they would call monasticism that we necessarily wouldn't think of as monasticism
Well,
monasteries today?
when we first encounter monks in written source material, in Egypt, for example, they seem to have been living just in ordinary houses or ordinary habitations in or on the edge of villages, and to have been very much part of village life. And that changes in the 4th century, where purpose-built monasteries, compounds containing what we think of as monasteries now, were built. And that seems to have happened around the Eastern Mediterranean in various ways. There were different kinds of models for monastic buildings. They range from what we would probably think of as a monastery, which is a set of buildings enclosed, perhaps with a wall, with a church or oratory, a place for worship, and living quarters. So that's the sort of standard pattern for communal monasticism. And we find that in Egypt, in the Holy Land, in Syria, in Asia Minor. But we also find regional variations of that type of settlement. So in Egypt and the Holy Land, we find groups of much smaller sort of communal, I suppose, social organisms, we might call them, monks living together in groups of cells, in almost kind of, sometimes we might think of them as small villages of monks, who have kind of banded together and built themselves huts or cells, or sometimes inhabited caves near each other. And there's very little to, in those cases, there's very little to architecturally to kind of bind them together. They just form a kind of community of hermits, if you like, or solitary monks. So there are different kinds of patterns, different models of what a monastery would look like in this early period between the late 3rd century and the 7th century.
So who founded to build these monasteries? Was it the state, or was it some wealthy landowners who decided to support these monks that wanted to build a monastery? How were they financed at least in the early start of their careers?
Well, some of them they're not really built by the state as such right early on. Some of them are built or established by local ecclesiastical authorities. So the bishops, the bishop of a region might found a monastery, or at least enable a community of like-minded monks and hermits to live together. Some of them are founded really as private establishments. So a good example would be the monastery that's founded by Basil the Great in the late 4th century for his sister Macrina. And that's, he was from a wealthy aristocratic family, and that was a monastery established basically on a family estate. And that's a model which continues throughout at least the eastern half of the Roman Empire, well into the Byzantine period. Sort of wealthy individuals just founding monasteries as sort of private concerns, as it were. And some of them, the kind of more informal ones, I suppose, are really founded by groups of monks who just band together and literally build something from scratch, and then have it approved by the ecclesiastical authorities or not, as the case may be. So there's a variety of different ways. The state does start to become involved a little bit later on. So the Byzantine emperors start to sponsor and found monasteries in the 6th century. There are a couple of examples, and from then on. So there are some examples of that, but not right at the start.
So there's someone I want to bring up now, because he will be a red line. I'm sure you know who I'm referring to already. And he is kind of a red line throughout monastic history, because of course that's Benedict. So let's talk about Benedict's rule and how he would be the kind of the father of monastic living and monastic style of living. So let's talk about Benedict's rule as well, which is kind of a drawn red line towards your book as well.
Yeah. Okay. So, given how important Benedict was, it's actually remarkable how little we know about him. What we think we know about him, a lot of it's probably made up. So there is a life of Benedict, which was written by Pope Gregory the Great in the later 6th century. And it forms the life of Benedict. He's one of the examples that Gregory uses in his book of his dialogues, as they're called, to illustrate monastic life. But we really have no way of knowing if what is said about Benedict in that life is genuine or not. Really, all we know about him is that he seems to have been the author of a rule, which is a remarkable document in a way. And it's remarkable not because it was so original. It's remarkable because it's really a perfect synthesis, in a way, of existing rules. So Benedict certainly didn't invent the idea of the monastic rule, still less the idea of monasticism. What he did was to take things from existing rules for living and blend them in a formula that actually worked extremely well in practical terms. And the fact that it's lasted really and continues to be used in the present day, I think, is testament to the skill and the kind of balance that he achieves between the different ways in which you need to construct a viable community. And that happened in the middle of the 6th century.
Do you have an examples of Benedict's rule that the monks would choose to follow?
An example from the rule itself.
Yeah.
Well, he talks. So the rule is quite carefully structured, and he starts out by defining monasticism, what he thinks monasticism is or should be. So he talks about the different kinds of monks, and for Benedict, there's really only one genuine way of being a monk, which is to be what he calls a cenobitic monk, which means someone who lives in a community with others. And unlike some previous legislators or founders of monasteries, Benedict has a very, very clear vision of what it means to live in a community. It means absolute abnegation of the self and of one's own will, and subordination of one's own desires to the community, the working of the community itself. It means stability. So the monk or nun, because the rule can also be used by women, the monk or nun is not to leave the monastery itself unless sent by their superior. You're there in your community until death once you've professed your vow. Benedict also sees the monastery as a school. He calls it a school for God's service. And he uses this kind of imagery of learning and developing the craft of being a monk or nun throughout the rule. So he says it's something you need to work at, to practice, and to get better at, really, throughout one's monastic career. So it's just as with other crafts, one has to learn how to, if you're a carpenter, you have to learn how to do the job, how to build things out of wood. So if you're a monk, you need to learn the business of being a monk. And so that's the way that he approaches the rule, and that is a kind of integral part of the rule throughout. It's divided into different sections, the rule. So he starts out off with quite general sort of advice and sort of, I suppose, a general ideology of the kind of service that's required and what a monastery is all about. And then he talks about the practical aspects of worship and describes the liturgical arrangements, and then more practical detail about the kind of internal discipline and the governance of the monastery, and the figure of the abbot as the father of the monks, and the relationship between abbot and monks in the community, and between monks and monks or nuns and each other in the community.
So early on, and we know that monasticism started in the West. So who could become a monk in the early monastic life? Was it mainly nobility and rich people, or could anyone, if they wished to become? Was there any criteria to becoming a monk if you wished to?
Not really. You certainly don't have to be ordained as a cleric, as a priest, in order to be a monk. In fact, there's really a separation between ordained clergy and monks in the first few centuries of monasticism. Some monks in the early period clearly were from wealthy backgrounds, from aristocratic backgrounds. They were well connected, they were well educated, but others really were from the peasantry. And that's true whether you look at Egypt or Italy or Asia Minor, wherever. So it's actually very, very fluid in the early period. Later on in the West, in the medieval West, between, I'd say, about let's say the 7th century and the 13th century, monasticism comes to be much more socially defined. So it does become an aristocratic profession in a way. And if you're talking about that period from about the 7th century onward, probably most monks and nuns in the West would have been from landed families. So really the kind of the elites, the landowning elites of society. That's not necessarily the case in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Orthodox world, where actually that kind of social fluidity remains a feature throughout the Middle Ages.
And I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves right now, and I will come back to this as well when we talk about Western monasteries. But I want to talk about a little bit Eastern now. So we read about how a lot of nobilities and especially emperors or empresses are retiring to monastic life,
Yeah.
to get a monastic life. So what was life like for them when they retired? Because we know, but usually when we think about monastic world, we think about dark damp cell, right? But that's maybe not the case if you are a nobility or an ex-empress. So they had a quite more comfortable life. So let's talk. So what was?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about when the empress or nobility would retire into a monastery.
Well, there are different reasons why an emperor or empress would retire to a monastery. So sometimes it might be, sometimes it's out of personal choice, but sometimes that might be imposed on them if they're inconvenient, if they've been deposed, for example, and the throne has been usurped, and sending your kind of defeated opponent, as it were, into a monastery is a good way of getting rid of them. At least you hope it is. So that we should distinguish between kind of voluntary retirement to a monastery and when it's imposed as a punishment. What's it like? It varies. I think it depends very much on the type of monastery. A royal foundation or an imperial foundation is going to be wealthier than a monastery that's emerged and developed in a less kind of obvious way. A monastery that has a rich endowment is going to have a better standard of life, and the wealthy, whether they're emperors or empresses or kind of aristocrats of whatever stripe, if they retire to a monastery, it's probably a monastery where the living is reasonably comfortable in most cases. And one shouldn't necessarily think that that monastic life is dark and dreary. It's probably, in comparison with the way that most people lived in the Middle Ages, it's probably a pretty comfortable existence for most people, and certainly in terms of sort of having regular food and shelter and so on. It's probably a reasonably good quality of life.
Let's talk a little bit about the motivation for why you would join the monastic world and why you would become a monk in the first place.
This is actually quite a much more difficult question to answer than it might seem, in a way. We would normally think, I suppose, that the people who join monasteries would have to be very pious and would have to be motivated by a very strong kind of interior spirituality, to be prepared to devote the rest of their lives simply to the worship of God and to living in community, to giving up individual private wealth and position and so on. And to a degree, that's true. As a historian, it's always very difficult to ascribe motives to people in the past. However, we have to see monasticism as a profession, and as normative in a way for much of the Middle Ages. It was a profession that people chose in the same way that we might choose to be a teacher or a soldier or a doctor or whatever. And the other point is that, and this is really important, in the West than the East, although it applies to both. not everyone in a monastery chooses to go there in the first place. And certainly this is true up to the 12th century in the West, up to about 1200 in the West. The practice of oblation, as it's called, means that probably the majority of people in monasteries didn't choose as, let's say, as rational adults to become monks or nuns. They were put there by their families as children. And although they then have to go through a process of actually taking vows formally, where technically they can, they can choose not to take vows, the evidence seems to suggest that most children who grow up in the monastery stay there. By the late 11th century, we have monks themselves saying that, Guibert of Nogent, for example, whose memoirs I talk about in the book, says at one point that most of the monks he knows in his monastery didn't choose to go there. They've been there since they were children. They were oblates originally. So we always have to remember that when we talk about motivation, that in many cases it's actually the motivation of their families rather than of them as individuals that explains why they are in a monastery or a convent.
And there are some tragic examples of that as well, when the children climb up to see where they used to live, and it feels that outside the monastery, some would eventually fall to that, or we don't know. Like you said in the book, we don't know if they jumped either to their deaths.
This issue about young men and women who wanted to leave monasteries and were unable to is one that I think it's very striking, and the instances that we know about are very tragic. We don't know that much about it, but I use the example of a monk called Gottschalk in the 9th century, because this was a famous case in the 820s in the Carolingian Empire, of a monk who had been placed in the monastery by his family, and then as a young adult he wanted to leave, and he's not allowed to, and the monastery does everything it can to keep him, and it becomes a cause célèbre, and it ends very, very tragically in the end. He doesn't have a happy life at all, Gottschalk.
I want to use this as an example. Keep in mind, now it's historical fiction, but I still want to use it as an example because in the Swedish writer Jan Guillou, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, in the series Arn, where he is forced to come into a monastery because he supposedly, and in the movie that she tried to, I'm not going to go into detail, but he's forced into a monastery because he apparently had a sexual affair. But could it be used as a punishment as well, as we see in the movie and the book on, where could entering a monastery be used as a punishment as well?
Yes, there are examples of being forced to go into a monastery as a punishment. I think strikingly, in certainly in the medieval West, it's probably more commonly used for women than for men, actually. Being sort of incarcerated as a nun, as a punishment, there are examples. I'm struggling to think of one now.
That's fine, don't worry.
But it's it's certainly something which women who have had illicit affairs, for example, sometimes sort of find that they are, the way to deal with them, the way to kind of diffuse the situation and get rid of them as a problem is to pack them off into a convent.
There are some bizarre examples as this. I'm not sure. I don't remember if this was in the West or the East, but where monks could go around in the market where they absolutely were naked, and that it was the most normal thing. And
Yeah,
it's explain how that would happen, like how someone could go
yeah,
naked into the market. It sounds bizarre in the 21st century,
yeah.
but was it as bizarre as it was to read about back then as well, or was that kind of
Yeah,
I'm not hesitant to use the common occurrence, but was it kind of bizarre back
yeah,
then as well?
yeah. It is bizarre, and it was at the time. And I use it's a particular example of a chap called Simeon the Holy Fool, as he's
Mm.
called, and it's a 7th century example. Um, um, so we have this kind of contemporary biography of this chap called Simeon, who initially became just a kind of ordinary monk, as it were, originally in the Holy Land, and then moved to Syria. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly in that early-ish period, there was quite a lot of fluidity between different types of monasticism. So it's not that unusual for someone like Simeon to have decided to kind of, as it were, learn the trade of being a monk in a celibatic community, and then to decide he wants to go off and be a solitary monk somewhere else. And this is what he seems to have done. And he seems to have developed his own form of kind of wandering monasticism, which was quite common in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's one of the things that Benedict in the West was absolutely set against. He didn't like that, didn't think that was proper at all. But Simeon the Holy Fool, his biographer talks about how he um, he sort of sets himself up to, as it were, to kind of question and challenge the accepted norms and social conventions of urban life in the kind of this very late Roman period in Syria. And so he turns up at a town announcing his presence as a holy fool, by dragging a dead dog behind him. And then he does all kinds of bizarre things to draw attention to himself. One of them is he gets a job working at a food stall, selling. He's supposed to be selling soup or stew in the market, but he starts giving it away for free, and the stall owner gets very cross with him. And then the incident that you refer to, Erland, where he's wandering around
Yeah.
naked, is because he decides to, or he's actually befriended by someone who suggests that it would be good for him to pay a visit to the public baths, presumably because he was quite smelly and dishevelled and unkempt. And so he says, "Oh yes, we'll go to the baths." But what he does is to take off his clothes in public, in the street or in the marketplace, and pile them in a bundle on his head, and go into the walk to the bathhouse like that, which is completely unconventional. Normally, you would expect to go into the bathhouse and then strip off there. But his logic is, you all think I'm mad for doing this, but actually, when you go to the bathhouse, this is exactly what you do: take off your clothes. What's the difference between taking off your clothes in the bathhouse or taking them off in a public place, if one's going to take them off anyway? So what he's trying to do always is to point to the inconsistencies, or the kind of foolishness of social conventions.
So there was a method to the madness, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, I suppose, there is a kind of inner logic to what he's doing, but um, he's also fulfilling a particular role, which seems to develop in the in the Eastern Mediterranean, of being a kind of public holy figure. And as a public holy figure, it's almost expected of you that you do odd things, and that you kind of provoke a reaction from the wider community. And there are different ways of doing that, and one way of doing it is to act in what is a very bizarre and way, and a very kind of simple way, to do things that are pretty stupid, and that's the idea of the holy fool, or the salos.
Mm.
It never really takes off in the West, but it's a very strong tradition in Eastern monasticism, and you find it also then in Russia as well, in that kind of monastic landscape later on.
I wanted to ask, I'm not sure how reliable this is, but I read a book a long time ago. I'm not sure if those hermits or monks in the East who would go and tie them up to nature to a stick and let the insects crawl upon them. They would stay there for days. It was an example of here, take my flesh, or some.
Yeah.
I'm not sure remember the cross, but was there monks that did this as well? Because this sounds. That's an example.
It's difficult to know whether all of those types of examples that one reads about are really true, because some of these examples come from hagiographical stories. There are lots of collections of hagiographies, many of them anonymous, many of them, just kind of circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean world from the 4th century onwards, and some of them rely on invention or a set of ideals, really, as much as a reality about a particular person. What we do know is that in Syria, in particular, there is a tradition of bodily mortification. Asceticism takes on this feature of bodily mortification. So, not just solitary monks in Syria, but often monks living in communities would develop or follow very what would seem to us very strange ascetic practices that are designed to cause them discomfort or pain. And there are contemporary descriptions of monks, for example, spending the night wedged into little niches in the stonework of a church, where they can't stand up straight or sit down, in order to kind of, to be very in discomfort, or even suspend themselves by ropes from the ceiling, or carry huge weights, suspend huge weights from their shoulders, or wear sort of like corsets under their tunics that were deliberately too tight to restrict their breathing, to remind themselves, by being kept in bodily discomfort, to remind themselves of that point that you started with, that monasticism should be a kind of martyrdom. So I'm not saying that most monks did this, but in Syria there seems to have been a strong tradition of this, and as I say, we have some textual descriptions of this, and actually that some of this is corroborated by archaeological evidence as well. Some of the monastic churches in Syria that have been excavated show evidence of these little niches that are talked about, where monks kind of wedge themselves for kind of prayer vigils at night. So that's always one strand of the monastic life. It's not necessarily typical, but it's always there.
I want to ask, I'll go to the West in a few minutes, but I want to ask first, when Islam came, and it came places such as Syria, Egypt, and that would later be conquered by the Islamic conquest, what would happen to the monasteries that would they fall apart, but it's still monasteries that continue to practice even under Islamic rule? I mean, we have the most famous example, perhaps, of all is Mount Sinai, that got the hand of the Prophet as a sign of that they should keep. They were allowed to keep going in peace, and so Sinai is perhaps the most famous example here. But what happened to most monasteries as they came under Islamic rule?
There's no big change, really. The early Islamic authorities had no interest in ending Christian monasticism, and so there's no real attempt to no attempt to disband monasteries or to destroy them or anything like that. I mean, during the early Islamic period, some monasteries do fall prey to violence. And if you look at monasteries in the Holy Land, for example, between the 7th century, the period of the Islamic conquest, and the 12th century, a lot of the monasteries that had been established before the 7th century did fall into ruin over the course of centuries. But in most cases, that doesn't seem to have been because of any kind of crackdown on monasticism by the Islamic authorities. There wasn't really any attempt at mass conversion or anything like that. So yeah, most monasteries carried on as normal.
We must spend so far talking mostly about the Eastern monasteries. But let's talk a little bit about the
Sure.
Western world. So how did the establishment of monasteries take place? Because as we spoke about with Peter Heather in last year in our episode about the Christianization of Europe, it was a slow development for Christianity to arrive to Europe. So let's talk a little bit about the development of monastic life in the Western world and the Christianization as well.
Well, the establishment of monasteries in the West, really from the time of Benedict onwards, went hand in hand with Christianization. So, for example, if one thinks about England, the Christianization of England, the mission of sent by Pope Gregory the Great at the very end of the 6th century to kind of to Christianize the then pagan English. That's done, largely by monks or monastic figures, and monasteries are established as part of that kind of mission to Christianize. And similarly, in the European continent more generally, monasteries are a way of establishing Christian worship under the control of a bishop. So it's very often bishops in late Roman and early medieval Gaul, for example, or Germany, who are founding monasteries, or who are involved in the founding of monasteries. And the aristocracy as well sees the founding of a monastery as a way to kind of bring control over a region. And so, yes, there is definitely a kind of a relationship or a correlation between this kind of project to Christianize and the implanting of monasteries in a rural landscape.
So let's talk a little bit about the contribution of the monasteries and what the contribution to society, because they had a role in it wasn't just prayer that were the order of the day. They had a role. They had agricultural land. And some monasteries even had serfs of their own, I believe. So let's talk a little bit about the contribution that monasteries attributed to society. Of course, by the end of this episode, we'll talk about the dissolution of monasteries as well, under Henry VIII and Joseph II, and talk about the contribution, the effect that had. And again, it comes down to this, because like I said, they had a role in society that they actually contributed quite a lot to the medieval world.
It's a role that developed quite gradually and that was not necessarily intentional in the first place. I mean, if one thinks about Benedict as a founder, Benedict was really Benedict was operating in a world that seemed to be falling apart. 6th century Italy is a landscape of war, of violence, of dislocation of populations. Italy is sort of is being fought over by the Emperor Justinian and the Goths, and so it's in that context that Benedict sees monasticism as a kind of civilizing force and as a way to preserve Christian culture in a world that literally seems to be falling apart. But I think the reason for the success of monasticism is its great adaptability and the fact that it was able to be useful to society. So, although it may not have been part of the original kind of, as it were, remit, as you say, monasteries from quite early on, developed this role as being places where culture is preserved. And because culture is preserved there, literally through the copying of books, through writing, it's also a place of education. So monasteries establish schools, particularly for young children, and in a world in which there is no kind of no safety blanket, no social security system, monasteries also fulfill the kind of functions of being a sort of social service, of providing alms for the poor and for the homeless, shelter for the homeless, a place of safety. Very often a monastery, particularly in early medieval Europe, would be the only stone building in vicinity. So it's also a place of refuge at times of natural disaster or in times of war and violence. And monasteries also establish hospitals and are places where the sick can be cared for. So all these kind of very basic social functions are kind of, monasteries are central to them. And monasteries often find that towns and settlements grow up around them for those kind of reasons. So one thinks about monasteries in Western Europe. Some of them were founded in towns already, but some of them are founded in really quite remote and obscure places. But villages and then towns kind of grow up around them because they are because they both need and provide sort of support through supply chains to a larger economy. The question of land and of monasteries as landowners is you asked about that, and that's really integral to the development and success of monasticism in the West. Basically, people give monasteries land. They become landowners because people give them land, either as an endowment or as a bequest. And monasteries also buy land themselves. They enter the land market. They basically in a society which is not a cash economy. Land is wealth lies in land, in agricultural land, and the ability to produce agricultural surpluses. So, in order to maintain and feed communities of people, monks and nuns, you need land. You need land to grow food or to keep livestock on. Whether you're actually farming the land yourself or renting it out to others, land is your income, basically. So we have to think of a monastery as a place where, as a kind of institution that is supporting, it might be a few score people, it might be a few hundred people, both monks, nuns, and a whole group of people who are servicing them, servants and so on, support staff. How are they to be fed? They have to be fed through, from an income that comes from the possession of land. And that raises the question then of why people give them land. Why do people support monasteries? Why do people want to found monasteries or to continue to enable them to exist? And it's a complex question, but basically what it comes down to is that supporting a community of holy men and women who are spending their lives in prayer is seen to be a kind of surrogate penance. So if you found a monastery, what you're doing is bringing into existence a group of people who are going to spend their lives in prayer for the good of the wider society. They're going to be interceding for you as the founder, your family, but also for the wider lay community, interceding before God for your souls through the masses that they celebrate the liturgical offices that they hold through their prayers and so on, and through their lives of sacrifice. So that's the thinking, really. These are people who are doing good for the community, not just in the practical ways that we've talked about through healing the sick, through teaching, through giving alms, but also they're fighting spiritual battles. The very fact that they're living these lives of devotion and worship is counterbalancing all the wrong things that are happening in the world. And they are seen really to be, therefore, absolutely essential for the salvation of human society.
Let's go a little bit to medieval England and the monastic world of England. And I want to especially talk about one monk in specific one monk, because he is kind of famous over there, and of course it's Bede. So let's talk a little bit about the Bede's contribution as well, and Bede's classical history, of course, and what the world of Bede.
Yeah, I mean, Bede is, I mean, in a way, he's probably one of the most famous English monks. He's probably more important as a historian than as a monk, in a way. But his ecclesiastical history is a kind of foundational document for later centuries. And what Bede does is to he's establishing a kind of an origin for the English people. He's explaining who the English people are and where they came from. And the fact that he's a monk, and he, as far as we know, had lived most of his life as a monk in Northeast, in Northumbria, means that he sees really kind of English Christian identity through a lens of monasticism. This is sort of, for Bede, monasticism is completely normative. And that's the way that he, according to Bede, that's the way that England came to be, as he would say, saved through the spread of monastic life.
Now, of course, the next thing I want to talk about is the Cluniac reforms at Clunia, which that is as well. So, what kind of what brought the Cluniac reforms?
Yeah, so this is beginning of the 10th century. The founding of the monastery of Cluny in 910 in Burgundy. In many ways, when it was founded, there was not much to distinguish Cluny from any other monastery that was being founded around the same time. It was founded by an aristocrat, by the Duke of Aquitaine, William, who gave a piece of land, a farm, basically, to a group of monks to establish a monastery dedicated to St. Peter. And let's start with the foundation document. William's foundation document, or probably the foundation document of Brno, who was the first abbot to whom William kind of gave this estate. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about Cluny is this document it really articulates a vision for monasticism that is very striking for its time. William, unlike most founding aristocrats, or I should say aristocratic founders of monasteries, unlike most of them, he gave Cluny complete independence. He gave the monastic community complete independence. He didn't want to have anything. He didn't expect to have any say in how it was run. He didn't want to treat it as his personal property, which many founding families did. So he made it reliant only on the papacy. So he creates this kind of conceptual link between this obscure monastery in an obscure part of Burgundy and Rome, the Holy See in Rome, which immediately kind of gives this new monastery, this fledgling community, gives it a kind of prestige. It's dedicated to St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, so there's that link with Rome. And for the first 100 years or so, there's probably nothing very remarkable about Cluny compared to a lot of other monasteries. But what the Cluniac community does is, I suppose, two things. First of all, they're extremely good at building up their land holdings piecemeal and in a very local and then increasingly more kind of regional manner. So it becomes one of the major landowners in an area which is politically very fragmented. And the other thing that Cluny does in that first 100 years is to develop a very distinctive liturgical style. And it's a very intense liturgy. It's said about 150 years after Cluny had been founded, it was said by a visiting monk that there's not half an hour in the day which isn't kind of taken up with some kind of liturgical office, which is completely against actually what Benedict had wanted. So there is a kind of accretion of liturgical observance that is built up. But it's greatly admired at the time. And so Cluny is asked by other founders or people who want to reform existing monasteries to teach them their chant, to teach them the special prayers that they say. And so Cluny is able to establish a kind of association, as it were, which cuts across political boundaries, across the whole of Western Europe, through this process of its customs and its liturgical customs, but also its kind of its way of living in a way. And really, that's what Cluny's fame and importance is based on, and that's why so it's not necessarily revolutionary. It's more an evolutionary process, I would say.
I want to go back a little bit in time before the 9th century, because of course very soon it will be in the early 8th century, of course, the Vikings will attack. So let's talk about the devastation of the Viking attack that it had on the, not just English monasteries, but as well on the coast of Europe as well. So let's talk a little bit about the devastation of the Viking attacks that it had on the monasteries.
Yeah. So the Vikings start to raid northwestern Europe in the end of the 8th century. So one of the most famous and notorious raids is on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. And that really starts a process, I suppose. And it's, as you say, it's not just England, not just English monasteries, it's also Ireland and northern France as well, particularly northwestern France. Anywhere where you can sail a longboat. So the River Seine, the River Loire, and so on are very handy for Vikings. And monasteries were already by that period repositories of wealth. They own objects which are spectacular, which are gold and silver and so on. They have liturgical objects which are very valuable. They sometimes have cash reserves as well, and they have livestock. And so they're natural places for Vikings to want to plunder. And there is some question about the extent of the devastation and also how long-lasting the effects of devastation were. In some cases, monasteries didn't seem to be able to recover. The monks simply abandoned locations and went elsewhere to further inland to try and escape the depredations of raiders. In other places, they seem to have been able to recover and carry on as normal. But the psychological effects, I think, are almost as important as the actual physical and economic effects on monasteries. The fact that you never knew when you were going to be attacked and what the damage and devastation would be. I think we have to accept that the Vikings must have been terrifying if you were a monk, and you didn't have much way of defending yourself. You knew that you were sitting on a lot of movable wealth that was attractive to raiders, and how are you going to protect yourself? And of course, it's a period in which public authority in much of northwestern Europe is just doesn't exist. It's a period of collapse, and of where, if you're in an outlying part of Europe, of England or the Carolingian Empire or whatever, by the time news of the Vikings' approach gets to anywhere that might be able to send help to you, it'd be too late.
So I want to ask, was there a relationship between the monasteries and the papacy, or were there some? What was that relationship like?
Yeah. So, excuse me.
That's fine. Don't worry.
I mentioned Cluny, and Cluny has a direct relationship with the papacy, and it makes a big deal of this to enhance its own prestige. But most monasteries don't actually have that direct relationship. In a way, monasteries are anomalous in terms of the overall structure of the church, because if you think about the hierarchy of the church, particularly in the Catholic Church in the West, you have the Pope at the head. The Pope operates through bishops and archbishops. Each bishop each bishop runs a diocese with a cathedral, based in a cathedral. Each cathedral is supposed to have a school and certain other functions. The bishop is supposed to be in charge of preaching, both himself and people he licenses to preach, and the bishop oversees a number of parishes in that diocese. So there's a very clear structure. Where do monasteries fit into that structure? Well, this actually is a big problem. In theory, monasteries came under the control of the bishop of the diocese in which they were located, and that ruling goes back to the 5th century. It's established in the Council of Chalcedon, and it's enshrined in Roman law. So the bishop should have oversight over all monasteries in his diocese. In practice, monasteries try to resist that, and the way they do that is to appeal often to the papacy, to appeal that they are exempt or should be exempt from episcopal oversight. And so there are exemptions that are created through a series of precedents, really from quite early on in the Middle Ages. Royal monasteries claim exemption, for example, and other monasteries invent reasons why they think they should be exempt from episcopal oversight. And one of the big struggles that's always going on within the medieval church is between bishops as the representatives of the papacy and monasteries which want to be autonomous and independent, and sometimes that leads to huge tensions, to legal battles, and so on. And the Pope is often kind of called in as the sort of as the judge and arbiter, and often, although it's perhaps counterintuitive, has to find in favour of a monastery, and uphold its exemption from episcopal oversight.
I want to talk a little bit about the Crusades as well, and monks and monasteries. Just as you write in your book, you may be surprised to see that the Pope didn't actually want the monks. And we talked about relationships, so it kind of fits nicely in here that even though some probably went, the Pope tried to avoid monks to actually go on the first crusade when it called out for crusade and defense of Jerusalem.
Yeah, so it's fairly clear that Urban II, when he launched the crusade in 1095 really had no intention of it being anything that would involve monks or nuns. Um, and But the fact that he had to say that sort of indicates that he probably thought that it was that there was likely to be interest from the monasteries in this. And in fact, we know that as early as the First Crusade, there are examples of bishops and archbishops who have to, and indeed abbots who have to stop monks from going on trying to go on crusade. But we also know that they weren't successful in many cases. And the contemporary narratives of the crusade have quite a few examples of monks, sometimes abbots, who disregarded papal instructions and joined the crusade. And that, I think, really tells us as much about the lack of control over the crusade that on the part of the papacy as it does about monasteries. I mean, one might well ask why monks would think that the Holy War was for them anyway. They're supposed to be, peaceful people who are in the monastery simply praying.
Yeah.
But one has to remember that the rhetoric of monasticism is about war. It's about fighting a continual war against the demonic powers. They see themselves as fighting a spiritual war all the time. And I suppose for some monks, they simply saw the holy war on earth as being a kind of a version, if you like, of that, what to them was a reality. Or perhaps for some of them, it was just an adventure, and they just wanted to, wanted a chance to get out of their monastery for a while. But certainly, right from the start, we do find monks and even nuns actually joining crusading expeditions. And then, of course, once crusading becomes much more established and a regular part of European life, in a way, kings who are putting together crusading armies will often take leading monks or even abbots with them. And the other role that monasteries have, of course, in crusade is in preaching crusades. So right from the start, Urban II, he gave he launched the crusade with an act of preaching, with a sermon. But he also licensed others and commissioned others to go around preaching for him. And this develops, therefore, from quite early on, that amongst the people who are licensed and commissioned to preach the cross, to preach crusades, are monks. And Bernard of Clairvaux is probably the most famous 12th century example, but he's certainly not the only one.
I want to talk a little bit about sexual relationships in monasteries, because as we spoke about this with Erlend Hedegart a few years ago, when we spoke about sex and sexuality in the medieval era, and we do know that even though like you said, they were supposed to be celibate, but it may be if they're supposed to be, not everyone necessarily were. So what would have happened to a monk if you were caught in a sexual relationship with, say, for example, a nun, because I do believe we do know that there were some monks and nuns that had sexual relations.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's inevitable. It's human nature, isn't it? So it would be impossible to even though it was prohibited, it would be impossible to stamp it out completely. So if one's thinking about Eastern monasticism, about monasticism in the Orthodox world, founders of monasteries are very, very clear that they see this as a potential problem. So they show a great awareness of the likelihood of there being sexual contact or sexual relations between monks. And so, Eastern monasteries each have their own foundation rule that's slightly different from the West. And very often the founding document will talk about will specify that there is to be no sexual contact and what the punishments are, which eventually are you get thrown out of the community. In the West, there's less said about that on the whole, but we know that it does go on. And one of the reasons why I think in a lot of monasteries it was part of the constitution of a monastery to keep a light burning at all times in the dormitory, in the communal dormitory at night, was to prevent any kind of inappropriate sexual behaviour by the monks. In terms of sort of monks and nuns, well, we have an interesting source from the 13th century, which is the visitation records of the Archbishop of Rouen in Normandy. He was a very vigorous bishop who tried and succeeded actually in upholding his legislative oversight over monasteries in the Archdiocese of Rouen. And we have this document, which is the visitation records for the years 1245 to 1246. So he's talking about all the monasteries and convents that he visits in this period and what he finds there. And there are a few cases where he's visiting a convent of women and he finds that nuns there are pregnant. It's not explained how they became pregnant, who the
God's will with it.
Yeah, but Clearly there has been some contact with men, whether that's and there's a famous case in 12th century.
Can that just use the "it's a miracle" excuse? That would seem like an easy way out.
They might well have tried, but they didn't. The Archbishop saw through that; he didn't believe it. There's a famous case in 12th century England because there is this phenomenon of the double monastery, monasteries for men and women. It's quite common early on in monasticism, and then it sort of dies out, but it's revived in the 12th century. And there's a group of monasteries in 12th century England called Gilbertine monasteries, which were foundations for women, but with men, a community of men attached to them as well. And there was a famous case at one of these Gilbertine monasteries called Wotton, which is in Lincolnshire, where evidently a young novice nun had become pregnant by one of the young monks. In these double houses, there was a wall built between the female side and the male side of the monastery. So they were supposed to be completely segregated physically, but evidently there were ways of getting around that, or climbing over or whatever. And so this did happen. In that case, actually, it's rather a horrific story. When the pregnancy is discovered, the monk runs away and he leaves the monastery. The other nuns are absolutely furious with the young nun who is pregnant and force her to reveal the name of the father. She does this eventually, and then they set a trap for the monk by forging a letter from her to him to sort of say, come and meet me at such and such a place on such and such an evening. And when he shows up, he falls into the trap, and they're there, the other nuns are there waiting for him. They fall upon him, attack him, castrate him, and imprison him. And the nun herself is imprisoned. And they then sort of send for another abbot of another monastery, Aelred of Rievaulx, to kind of look into it and decide what should be done with her. And you mentioned that the miracle of this is the Holy Spirit. Well, a miracle does take place. That according to Aelred, we know about this from a letter that Aelred himself wrote about it. And he explains that when he was called in to advise on this, the nun herself one day it was found that the pregnancy had disappeared, and this is attributed to a miracle. That and we might think of all kinds of reasons that it was a phantom pregnancy, or that she thought she was pregnant, or they thought she was pregnant, she wasn't really, or whatever, or to an illicit abortion. But it's presented, in Aelred's report in his letter as being a miracle that has worked, that the nun is restored to her sort of chastity through this miracle. But the fact that this kind of cause célèbre was written about at the time shows that it happened, and that it was clearly something that could happen despite the precautions that were taken in double monasteries.
So let's talk a little bit about the difference between a nunnery and monks' monasteries. Because you write a little bit about this in the book as well. So, like you said, so early on, in some cases, they were not just separated by a wall, but when it came to monasteries that were just for women, what was the difference between a female monastery and a male monastery?
So the big difference is that women obviously could not celebrate Mass. And so, although they could say many of the liturgical offices themselves, they always needed to have a chaplain, a male chaplain who was an ordained priest, there, either to come in regularly to say Mass, but also to hear confessions, and to bury the dead monks, to anoint the sick, and so on. So all the sacraments would need to be done by someone who is either a chaplain to the community, or the convent would need to have the service of priests. So that's one big difference, is that a female monastery, a convent, can never completely do without at least some men for that reason. But the other perhaps bigger point is that, although I said that at the beginning that Benedict's rule was, could be followed by women as well as by men, he certainly wrote it with men in mind. And although there were other early monastic rules in the West written for women, by people like Caesarius of Arles, for example, they seem to have fallen into disuse and not to be known about later on. And so by the 12th century, Benedictine convents, sometimes find that they are finding that it's more difficult for them to follow the rule of Benedict in the same way as a male monastery can, because Benedict, the attitude is very much, well, you can, if you're a female community, follow the rule of Benedict as well as you can, and where you can't, you're kind of exempt, you're an exception to the rule. And so some reformers in the 12th century, such as Eloise, for example, the erstwhile lover of Peter Abelard, who was herself the abbess of a community, of a monastic community, thought that actually the rule of Benedict, or that the women needed a rule for themselves, because their use of the rule of Benedict really presupposed that they were always exceptions to that rule. So there were things like, for example, getting up in the middle of the night, or things about the safety of women and so on, which Eloise didn't think the rule of Benedict really kind of took account of, and things like the number of liturgical hours, but also manual labour and so on, which. So she's really pointing out that the rule had been written with men in mind, and that it needed, monasticism needed a rule to be written specifically for a female community. Nothing happened as a result, But she's making this point. So there are very practical differences in the way that a female community would run, as opposed to a male community. Also, you were asking earlier about the papacy. In the 13th century, toward the end of the 13th century, Pope started to get concerned about women and enclosure, and so in 1290 there is a papal bull enforcing female enclosure, basically forcing nuns to kind of stay in their own space, to stay enclosed, because there's a fear about them trying to get around that and sort of leaving the monastery and being, and so on.
So something I want to ask as well, because we spoke earlier about who should become monks and what were the requirements of them. And we basically thought that you didn't need any requirements, basically. But when it came to being an abbess or abbot, what was their higher requirement? Should anyone become? Or did you have to be of a higher standard of living if you wanted to become an abbot? Should you rise in the ranks from being just normal monks to change from lower society than, say, a noble or aristocrats?
Yeah. So it probably helped to be of noble or aristocratic origin. Certainly up to about 1200, it's probably normal for most abbots or abbesses to have been from the ranks of the aristocracy. And some aristocrats are appointed abbots at a very young age. And Peter the Venerable, who was abbot of Cluny from 1122 onwards, was in his 20s when he was elected abbot, and that's probably because he was from a very prominent family. The rule of Benedict, of course, doesn't give any priority to social origins. It says that the abbot should be elected by the kind of the senior monks, basically that they should form a committee and elect the person who they thought was the best for the role. But he wasn't very specific about what you were looking for in an abbot. There is actually a very interesting discussion of this in a early 13th century source, which is a chronicle of Bury St Edmund's monastery in East Anglia, in England, by one of the monks of the monastery, Jocelyn of Brakeland. And he talks about the election of a new abbot in 1180. And his chronicle is really a sort of biography of this abbot who was elected in 1180, Abbot Sampson. And he describes the process of election, which was quite complicated and involved a committee of electors who then come up with a set of names from monks from within the monastery and then present that to the king, and the king has to approve their choice. But actually, even more interesting is his description of the discussions that take place informally amongst the monks before the election takes place. He talks about how it's all the monks will talk about in little groups in the cloister, and different opinions are expressed about what kind of person do we want. Would it be best to have someone who is very holy, very pious? But such people are often not very good at actually running the monastery's estates, and Bury is a wealthy monastery and has a lot of land and dependencies and so on, and we don't want it to be run into the ground by someone who doesn't know what they're doing, has no practical sense. Should we go for a scholar? Well, yes, but some such people are often very pedantic and and so on. Or should we go for?
It was a tricky choice.
Yeah. So they were very aware that there wasn't that there were different criteria, and that getting someone who was ideal and all rounder wasn't always easy.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the disillusionment. We're going to end up soon, but I want to end with the disillusionment of monasteries. But first, I want to talk about the Eastern disillusionment. And we mentioned how when the Islamic conquest came, that there weren't much consequences of that. The monastic world would be left mostly alone. But when the Ottomans came, it will be quite a different story from, say, early Islamic conquest.
Yeah, I think it's still not necessarily the case that the Ottomans wanted to end Christian monastic life. It's really rather that by the 15th century, most monasteries in the Byzantine Empire had simply run their course. They'd been run into the ground. There were real problems with keeping themselves going financially. A lot of them had become dependent on the Byzantine state, even if they hadn't originally been founded by emperors, or dependent on a wealthy aristocracy, which was no longer wealthy. And so in part it was really a financial reality as much as anything else. Not all monasteries were abolished or ended by the Ottomans. So the monasteries on Mount Athos, for example, continue, and obviously still.
Sinai, for example, of course.
Sinai, continued, and some of the ones in the Holy Land as well continued. St. Saba is the most prominent example, but a lot of them had just run on hard times and run out of money and means of support. It's a different story in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Now let's go to the Western world, and I want to bring. I know you mainly talked about Henry VIII, and we made an episode about this a while ago as well with Jeremy Clark. But who now you mentioned in the book as well. But I wanted as well, and someone that you don't bring up is also the disillusionment of Joseph II, because there's a clear distinction between the disillusionment between Henry VIII, who was more forceful, let's say. I mean, I'm not saying Joseph II. There's a more reasonable reason why. It's a reasonable reason why Joseph II disillusioned his monasteries rather than, say, Henry VIII. There's a huge bit difference between the two, and why both rulers chose to disillusion the monasteries.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know too much about Joseph II
That's fair.
And the situation there. But in writing about the dissolution in England, I was actually quite heavily reliant on James Clark's book on the dissolution of monasteries, because it's the most recent and
it's a brilliant piece of work as well.
Most comprehensive work on the subject. And what struck me in James's work is the point that he makes that kind of runs through the book, that it almost kind of happened by accident, in a sense, that it really wasn't necessarily intentional. It wasn't a grand vision, certainly not on the part of Henry VIII, and that as late as the 1520s, abbots and monasteries were still really seen as an integral part of the ecclesiastical and social and political scene in England. But that once you started to unpick the structure, it actually fell apart pretty quickly. And what really surprised me in reading that book was how complicit so many monasteries were in their own dissolution. Not all, and there are famous cases, the ones who resisted, the Charterhouse in London, for example. But so many of the monasteries, the abbots and communities simply sort of said, "Yeah, it's time for us to finish.
I'm done.
Yeah,
we're
done here." And that, I think, is really kind of revealing of how perhaps they were, sort of they'd run their course in many cases. A lot of them were, of course, very poor by that stage. They weren't being supported in the ways they had been, and that's really to do with competition.
That's interesting, because one of the accusations when Henry VIII disillusioned the monasteries is that they had so much riches, and that's one of perhaps the biggest misconception when it comes to that. Henry VIII it can be accused of many things, but the monasteries is maybe not one of those things he necessarily can be accused of, and certainly not the riches case.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the people who enriched themselves were often local landowners who were able to kind of take over and buy monastic land and property at very low rates. But a lot of the monasteries really had very little income by that stage, and I think in large part that's because society was much more complex than it had been in, say, the 12th century. And there were so many other ways for the prosperous laity to give, to charity, to spiritual charity. There are the friars as well, but there are also many, many institutions. Their own parish churches, for one thing, guilds, lay communities, lay confraternities, and so on. It's a much more atomized and fragmented church, and the emphasis is much more on people finding their own kind of route to salvation rather than simply entrusting it to monasteries. You that's your job. And so I think monasteries had kind of were seen to have sort of run out of, no longer to have that original purpose that they would have had a few hundred years earlier.
I'm not sure devastating is the right word here, but there were some consequences of the disillusionment as well, which, as we talked about earlier, they would function as hospitals or lay or shelters. So this kind of disappeared with the disillusionment of the monasteries as well. So there were some consequences of this.
There were, and this is why the Elizabethan government in the later 16th century had to create the poor laws. And to make parishes responsible for maintaining poor people and giving shelter and alms to those who couldn't support themselves, because suddenly that kind of safety net that monasteries had provided just wasn't there anymore.
So I think we're going to run it up there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Of course, before you go, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And where can people find your book, The Monastic World, that came out last year? And do you have any social media you want to share? If people have more questions about the monastic world, where can people find you? If they want to ask more questions, where can people buy your book? If they want to buy it, and you definitely should, it should be essential reading on the monastic history. So what if you have any links you want me to share, where can in the description? Now's the time to promote your work.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm not very up on social media, so I don't have much of a social media presence. But you can find me on LinkedIn, and most bookshops are still, I think, stocking it, and you can certainly get the book on Amazon and other such portals. So
thank you so much for coming on again. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. This has been What That Aged Well. Well, we are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you like this episode, you can, and you should. It would be nice if you could give us 5 stars on Spotify, or you can write a review on Apple Podcasts or Amazon. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. And check out some other episodes. We got to, for example, the one we mentioned, the disillusionment of the monasteries with James Clark, which is relatable to this one. We'll go more in depth on the dissolution of the monasteries. So check that one out. We have as well one relatable to this episode is the Christianization of Europe with Peter Hedder, which came out last year, late 2023, not 2024. But check those episodes out. My name is Erlend, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.